Imagine a war so long it outlasted kings, crumbled castles, and saw the rise and fall of empires, one that began with a claim to the throne and ended with a question of identity. The Hundred Years' War wasn't just a battle between England and France. It was a slow, aching reshaping of Europe itself. But tonight, there's no rush through bloodied fields or royal courts. We'll walk gently across the misty moors of Normandy, past whispered alliances and forgotten treaties, to a time when nights rode into twilight and history stretched across generations like a weary sigh if quiet history soothes your restless nights and you'd rather fall asleep to the sound of crumbling crowns than scrolling screens. Click subscribe, light the bell icon, and leave a soft like. Each episode helps bring these forgotten stories back, slowly, calmly, and just in time for sleep. You begin with a map where the edges are not clean. Northern France is patchworked with counties and duchies. Some swear fealty to the King of France, some to their own traditions, and one long strip on the southwestern coast, Gascony, answers to a king in England. The borders do not behave like the solid lines you imagine. They move with marriages, with oaths, with confiscations written on parchment. You find that the 100 Years' War did not begin with a single trumpet blast. It crept forward within offices and courts, with clerks opening wax seals, with sheriffs tallying sacks of wool, with collectors noting down ton after ton of Bordeaux wine. If you are patient, and you listen to these dull sounds, quills scratching, ropes lifting barrels, you will hear the first notes of a century of fighting. A century before the famous battles, the kings of England held the Duchy of Aquitaine as vassals of the French crown. This meant that an English king, sovereign on his own island, owed homage to a French king for land he held across the Channel. The arrangement could function so long as both sides tolerated the contradiction. Feudalism specialized in contradictions that were made tolerable by ritual, a kneeling in a hall, a kiss on the cheek, a formula spoken in Latin or French. But rituals could not force human pride to cooperate forever. Periodically, officials quarreled about the precise limits of a bailiff's jurisdiction, whether a petty court in the Landes could appeal to Bordeaux, whether a ship seized for smuggling should be released on the duchy's say-so or held under the king's high justice. These were small fights, but small fights accumulate like stones in a shoe. You can walk for miles like that, but you are never comfortable. And sooner or later you stop. By the early 14th century, the English crown had something it could not do without: the trade in wool and wine. English wool, fine, long, and heavily sought by Flemish weavers, brought customs revenues that propped up royal accountants' ledgers. Gascon wine, packed in tons, counted in thousands, rolled from warehouses to quays, flowed to English tables and London taverns, and brought coin back the other direction. This commerce was managed by uninteresting men, by factors and port wardens, by tally sticks and seals. But each uninteresting step tied England to southwestern France. When a French king threatened those connections, he was not merely quibbling with another monarch. He was tugging on an English ruler's purse and on thousands of ordinary livelihoods. You picture a dockside in Bordeaux, cogs tied up too deep, rope creaking, a clerk reading a list of cask marks under his breath, a cooper tapping a stave with a mallet, a merchant's apprentice chalking an initial on wood. There is no glamour here, yet this is one nerve of the war. Succession, always delicate, added another nerve. In 1328, the Capetian line in France failed in the male line. The French peers chose Philip of Valois, who became Philip VI as king. He represented continuity in the eyes of men who valued order over all things. Across the Channel, Edward III of England, grandson of a French king through his mother, had a plausible claim that could be worded to a lawyer's satisfaction and wrapped in banners to a herald's. In truth, neither man wanted to test legitimacy by bloodshed if it could be helped. Edward performed homage to Philip for Aquitaine in 1329, a dance of words and posture, thick with symbolism and thicker with anxiety. Did the English king pay liege homage, the highest form, or simple homage for the lands he held? A dozen jurists could pass the phrases and not be done by supper, but what mattered was that a relationship diseased at the root continued another day. During these years, officials disciplined each other with instruments of government. Confiscations were a favourite tool. The French crown would declare the Duchy of Aquitaine forfeit for some alleged breach. English protest would follow. Negotiation would restore what threat seized, but only after coins changed hands and deference was publicly displayed. You can think of these as routine, like a recurring ailment that flares and subsides. Yet routine infection weakens the body. In 1337, Philip VI moved to a comprehensive confiscation. This time, Edward III answered not with pleading but with royal banners and fleets assembled, loans gathered under seals, and indentures written in chancery to hire men for terms of service. The English crown learned to think like a contractor, setting rates for knights, esquires, mounted archers, and foot archers, specifying how many horses and how many arrows each retinue would bring. It is all very dull in the telling, an office full of contracts, but that is what an army looks like before it moves. At sea, another set of dull realities taught lessons. English ports on the south coast were raided by French and Genoese galleys. English merchants answered with reprisals, and the word piracy hovered as a judgment that depended on who wrote the report. At the Battle of Sluys in 1340, a tangle of masts and rigging turned into a floating battlefield where ships were chained and men fought at close quarters with pikes and axes, as if the sea itself were a narrow street. Afterward came lists, dead men's names, ships' inventories, repairs authorized, payments promised to captains whose vessels had been damaged in the king's service. England's victory at sea opened the Channel, and paperwork flowed in its wake. The war, when it came ashore, preferred logistics to flashy heroism. Before the summer of 1346, English administrators sent writs to sheriffs to assemble carts, draft horses and farriers, to coastal towns to prepare cogs and barges, to the wardrobe to release bowstaves and arrowheads from stores. For longbows, the crown relied on imported yew staves as well as native sources, and on an army of craftspeople whose names do not make it into chronicles, fletchers who bound goose feathers to shafts, bowyers who shaped staves with knives and backed them with heartwood and sapwood's tension, blacksmiths who forged bodkin points intended to punch through mail, and the weaker plates of less affluent men-at-arms. It is a line of quiet skill that stretches between forests in the Alps and a field in northern France. And you may find the line more interesting the longer you look at it. When you walk into an English village of the time, the law's attention to archery is visible in strange ways. There are statutes urging practice on Sundays, warning against too much play at football or dice. You hear the thump of arrows on butts stuffed with straw or earth, and think about habit. That skill is less a miracle than a thing done over and over until you can do it in wind or rain, with cold fingers after sleeping on bad ground. The men who drew heavy bows did so not through sudden bursts of zeal, but through years of muscle memory. Hardly a stirring thought as you listen in the half-dark, more a reminder that the war was made by practice as much as by passion. On the other side, French power rested in layered hierarchies and a dense network of castles and fortified towns. Communities did not expect to ride out and meet invaders in open fields whenever alarm bells rang. Instead, they trusted their walls, their lords, and the king's summons to the arrière ban, the general call to arms. A town would keep a rough inventory of crossbows, spearheads, powder for the few early guns that appeared in mid-century, and stores of grain and saltfish. If you take the time to imagine ledger pages filled with lines about barrels of herring, you will be closer to the truth of a siege than if you imagine only banners snapping in high wind. Edward III's 1346 campaign across Normandy and northern France looked spectacular to men who enjoyed cavalry charges and coats of arms painted on shields. but it was powered by forage parties and commissioners of victuals. An army marching through summer wheat could live off the land, but not without method. Men were assigned to gather fodder for horses to seize or purchase flour, to bake bread in field ovens hastily dug and lined with stones. The king's clerks kept track of purveyance, the right to take goods for the crown's needs at set prices, prices that could be delayed in payment to the chagrin of the suppliers. You should picture disputes conducted in marketplaces as much as in battle lines. A butcher arguing about the number of cattle seized, a miller complaining that his wheels stood idle while soldiers used his grain store. Money threaded these movements together. To finance campaigns, the English crown borrowed against future customs, particularly the wool subsidy, turning a nation's sheep into collateral. Merchants who advanced funds expected repayment, and they expected protection for their ships and convoys. So the war's weight fell on men who kept accounts, on scribes who reconciled columns, on aldermen who guaranteed bonds. Meanwhile, in France, the crown's need for coin pressed upon towns and peasants through tails and aids, direct and indirect impositions that were heavier when harvests failed or when war cut trade routes. It is hard to make such matters thrilling, but coin determines whether soldiers are fed, and if soldiers are not fed, they are dangerous to everyone. Chroniclers lingered over the Battle of Crécy, fought in August 1346, because battles are compact stories. But the more diffuse story runs along the edges. A ditch dug here, a hedge line used for cover there, a decision to fight dismounted rather than in the saddle. Freeing horses to be held in the rear, while men with bills and axes braced their feet in ground they had felt with their hands. The Genoese crossbowmen hired by the French had bows that required winding and reloading. Their pavises, large shields, protected them but slowed their movement. The weather and the timing of orders mattered. The English archers sent arrows in clouds rather than in a steady pecking fire. Each arrow had been paid for, carried, and protected from damp. Each was a small expense justified when it found a seam in an opponent's armor or an unprotected horse. A battlefield consumes supplies. That is what a battlefield is. After Crécy, the English army moved north to begin the siege of Calais, a town that sat at a strategic pinch point of the Channel coast, with marshland protecting its approaches. Siege warfare is monotony turned into policy. You dig, you build, you sever lines of supply, you protect your own from disease and boredom. Edward ordered the construction of a ring of forts and earthworks, a collar to keep the town from breathing. The English also used the sea, setting blockades with ships and paying attention to tides and channels. Calais had its food measured by the day. Inside the walls, officials counted barley and salted meat, weighed loaves, noted the deaths of beasts, imposed rations that cut more deeply as weeks became months. They would have counted candles and lamp oil too, because darkness is a ration as much as bread is. You may feel restlessness thinking about it. The town's life slowed to the speed of men on watch, of women scraping kettles, of children noticing which neighbours looked thin. In England during the siege, a different tempo prevailed. The Crown pushed to designate Calais as the staple for English wool, a central mart where all wool exports would pass through designated brokers under controlled conditions and monitored customs. This was not a romantic decision. It was a fiscal one. A single staple planted in a secure coastal town allowed the king to tap the trade efficiently and to reward merchants who cooperated. Town charters, privileges, and staple ordinances are dry reading. They are also levers that move heavy stones. You should consider the warehouse as a siege weapon, the ledger as a gatehouse. In the English encampment outside Calais, the ordinary business of an army continued. There were laundresses who hauled water and tried to keep linen tolerable in damp weather, armourers who repaired rivets and straps, surgeons who boiled their knives and tried to keep fever from ripping through the ranks. Men brewed weak ale because water alone could be untrustworthy. They bought fish and bread from camp followers who set up stalls. The routines of bowel and bladder, of blisters and coughs do not feature in nightly memoirs, but they govern any long stay in bad conditions. Horses required farriers, grooms and hay. Bows required spare strings. Arrows required resupply. Tents required mending. When a royal army encircled a town, it was also a town of its own, with little industries working by lamplight. The French crown tried to raise a relieving force and to break the blockade, relying on feudal summonses and hired men. But campaigning calendars were not elastic. Harvest had to be brought in. Vassals had obligations to their own households. Wine had to be crushed and barreled when the grapes came in. You will find, if you watch closely, that war remains subordinate to bread. Even kings plan around the tasks of autumn. The failure to relieve Calais promptly was not mere incompetence. It was the result of systems working the way they always worked, slower than fear demanded. Inside Calais, decisions were cruel but ordinary. Authorities expelled mouths they could not feed, hoping the besiegers would allow women and children to pass. Sometimes the English did, sometimes they did not, because pity is measured against policy in sieges. The town's government had to keep order without bread to pay soldiers or confidence to sell. Bakers stretched flour with whatever would bind. Salt was counted grain by grain. Wells were watched. There were debates over whether to hold out for terms that guaranteed property or to surrender and trust to royal mercy. Such debates are not grand speeches. They are arguments in council chambers that smell of sweat and tallow smoke. You might picture the mayor's hand on a table, scarred by years of use, tapping a finger to keep silence while a clerk reads a letter from the king that promises relief, which does not come before winter. You see then that the 100 Years, war's first famous phase, owed as much to ports, mills, and counting houses as to any knight's courage. The key figures, Edward III and Philip VI, moved pawns on a board, built by men who did not think of themselves as pieces at all, only as people doing their jobs, a sheriff in Kent writing to a supplier about wagons, a Gascon cooper measuring hoops, a Parisian clerk drafting a confiscation order, a Flemish weaver praying that ships will arrive before his looms fall silent. When you think this way, you realize that history is not ledgers or blood alone. It is both, and the combination is what wears you down or builds you up. By the late months of 1346 and into 1347, the English ring tightened, the French crown hesitated, and the town thinned out. The siege of Calais promised to end with formalities. Keys presented, a garrison marched out under fixed terms, the victors entering in order to set up a new regime that would suit their fiscal and military needs. The myths that later gathered about this moment, about burghers and ropes, about mercy displayed, sit atop whatever agreements surviving records confirm. But beneath the myths lies a practical question that you can feel in your own stomach. What happens to a town's daily life when the king outside the walls decides that no relief will come, and the king within must choose between honor and hunger? You stand again before the walls of Calais, and you take in the quiet that follows a long siege. The English encirclement had functioned as a slow, deliberate machine. Earthworks, watchfires, controlled channels, and a maritime chokehold. Inside the town, civic life had been reduced to ration tables and decisions about who might be allowed to eat that day. In the late summer of 1347, Calais' leaders agreed to yield. The ritual which chronicles dress in dramatic fabric, keys presented, terms negotiated, faces austere, can be understood as the public conclusion to an administrative process that had, for months, been turning private anguish into public policy. You can imagine the practical logistics after surrender: inventories compiled, property marked for confiscation or protection, lists of the townsfolk who would be allowed to remain because their trades were useful to the victors. English officers trained by chancery habits, moved to install a garrison to superintend repairs and to prepare the town for its new role as a bridgehead and a commercial staple, a fixed point from which the kingdom would touch the continent with a steady hand. From Calais, The English crown set about institutionalizing what had worked. The staple for wool would be installed here under rules that pleased royal accountants. Brokers would register shipments, customs officers would take their due, and merchants would be enticed by security to make the journey across the channel. For you, the listener, the scene is not thrilling. It is a counting house with men who smell of wool grease and sea air, discussing the season's clip and whether the price set by royal ordinance is bearable. But this is how a conquest pays for itself. And you can follow the flow of money like a persistent stream that cuts its own stones smooth over time. In the wake of an army comes the clerk, and behind the clerk comes the tax farmer, and beyond him comes the man who lays out coins and expects those coins to multiply. Almost immediately after the fall of Calais, a different, invisible enemy crossed the same sea: plague. You step into the year 1348 and imagine trying to keep books balanced when men stop coming to work because they are dead. The Black Death did not honor treaties, ports, or garrisons. It entered households in both kingdoms, reduced assumptions to ash, and interrupted the predictable cycles on which governments depend. In England, manorial rolls recorded tenants falling vacant. In France, labour thinned in fields and towns alike. Priestly registers filled with hurried notes. Military plans unspooled in chancelleries met the lagging reality of a countryside with fewer carters and fewer horses, fewer archers to be mustered by sheriffs, fewer masons to work on walls. The plague taught both crowns how fragile their logistics actually were, that the chain of obligation from court to village is only as strong as the hands that can take up a plough or string a bow. In fear, people looked to heavens and customs. Rulers looked to coin. War did not end because plague came. It paused, it shifted, and then it resumed in forms suited to the human material remaining. Scarcely anyone would call the chevauchée a noble form. It was, instead, a mounted raid designed to force choices. Columns of English and allied Gascon men, disciplined by contract and familiarity with countryside, burned mills and barns, scooped up ransom, and dared the French to fight them on ground of their choosing. The chevauchée worked because it touched what rulers wished to protect: the productive base. If you consider the dull solidity of a miller's wheel or a granary's boards, you will grasp why the raids mattered more than banners. A flaming barn is a tax not collected, and a mill burned is a community that must walk farther to grind its grain. When the English king and his captains planned a chevauchée, the documents took shape months before hoofbeats did. Indentures named the captains and their retinues. Victualling orders specified quantities of salted meat, biscuit, and ale. Forage plans emphasized moving light and striking fast. Local guides, men who knew streams and fordable places, were as valuable as armored knights. The lance rest was less important than the parish map in a clerk's head. Meanwhile, in France, the royal council deliberated how to answer, whether to block crossings and bridges, whether to assemble their own forces through the arrière ban, whether to protect the countryside and accept the insult, or to seek a field battle in which the honour of the crown could be satisfied. Honour and prudence did not always talk to each other. When they argued, towns burned. In 1355 and 1356, these rhythms came together in the events that would fix themselves in chronicles: the English and Gascon chevauchée that raked through southern and central France, and then, in September 1356, the battle near Poitiers. You might expect to be told here of straight lines of armies marching with mathematical certainty toward a confrontation. It is more honest to tell you about miscommunications, scouts reporting contradictory things, a narrow lane cutting through hedged fields where no one had expected the path to bottleneck, and captains pressing their men to stay in formations that seemed more like patience than courage. John II of France, a king who wanted to assert his dignity by bringing the raiders to account, found himself before an English-led army that had chosen ground and manner of fighting with care. The English position among hedges and vines, with ditches and sunken ways, turned movement into effort. Men dismounted not because chivalry required them to fight on foot, but because on that patch of land horses would serve them better as targets than as platforms. During Poitiers, the longbow's work returned to the fore. Arrows do not sound heroic, but they can be counted. Each archer carried a sheaf. Each sheaf had to be protected from damp. Fletchers had to make good the supply after every action lest the army's firepower diminish in the next. Under arrow fire and advancing against obstacles, French formations struggled to maintain coherence. In the press, decisions made sense only to men struggling for breath. When the French broke, they did so unevenly, and in that unevenness lay the capture of a king. John II was taken in the chaos, and with him the crown's honor, the reality of governance, and the meaning of debt all changed at once. Captivity for such a personage was not a dungeon but a contract. A king in English hands was a king translated into a schedule of payments and guarantees that could be pledged by territories and persons as hostages. You should pause here and picture a treaty not yet signed but already imagined in columns of numbers. Ransom was not just a single sum. It was structured in installments backed by pledges, timed against tax collections and enforced by hostages, sons of great lords, the king's own kin sent to England and kept in conditions calibrated to their rank. These hostages lived quietly in households arranged for them, hunting and learning languages, sometimes marrying into English nobility when negotiation dragged on. If you imagine the lives of these men, you will learn a kind of boredom filled with etiquette and the feeling of being useful to your sovereign merely by existing and being accounted for in correspondence. For every famous name, dozens of lesser captives were also held, their ransoms negotiated by family, guild, or parish. The machinery of debt, backed by honor and by the fear of permanent disgrace, reached from gilded halls to modest cottages where a craftsman's tools were pawned to help redeem a cousin. France did not stop functioning because its king was captive. The Dauphin, Charles, governed as regent and found the task of stabilizing a coinage battered by debasement to be more urgent than composing speeches. In times of war, rulers attempted to strike coins with less precious metal to cheat the arithmetic of silver content and make money multiply while values dissolve. Merchants who weigh coins and not promises did not tolerate such games willingly. The 1350s in France were a laboratory of fiscal strain, increased tails, experiments with currency that bred confusion and anger, and the convocation of the Estates General to legitimize taxes in exchange for reforms. The estates, an assembly of clergy, nobility, and the third estate of townsmen, found their voice. You can hear it in the petitions that walked the line between loyalty and that practical resistance born of fear that the shop would be empty, the granary thin, and the road unsafe. In Paris, Etienne Marcel, provost of the merchants, pushed for reforms that would bind taxation to oversight. The city's popular fervor merged uncomfortably with elite calculation. The debates in the city hall were not framed as revolt. They were framed as responsible guardianship over the commonweal. Yet reform in wartime is a nervous business. With the countryside harried by bands of soldiers owed wages, with towns garrisoned and men fatigued by levies, small sparks filled the air. In 1358, the Jacquerie, an uprising of peasants, burst across parts of northern France, not neat in its program or consistent in its aims, but terrible in its expression of accumulated pressures. Noble households struck back with ferocity, sometimes with the help of townsmen who feared chaos more than they resented lords. The Dauphin's circle survived the maelstrom, Etienne Marcel was killed, and Paris resumed a more constrained conversation with the crown. When you consider these events, remember stables and granaries as much as banners and coats. Scarcity sharpens all arguments. On the English side, the victory at Poitiers and possession of a royal captive did not translate automatically into stable peace or easy revenue. Payments had to be collected, and those who promised to pay preferred deferral. Meanwhile, military enterprises continued. Garrisons cost money day after day, quiet in their consumption, and loud only when their wages fell into arrears and they opened the gates to pillage. Free companies, bands of men-at-arms and archers who drifted between employers, thrived in this economy of intermittent war and imperfect peace. They camped along roads, took to extorting protection money from districts, and hired out to those who could offer coin and plunder. The crown could not control them completely. Local communities learned to negotiate with them as they negotiated with floods and bad harvests, by paying and praying for their departure. The plague did something else that matters for your ear's purposes. It created vacancies that allowed upward movement. Surviving peasants sometimes rented larger holdings. Surviving artisans bargained for better terms. Surviving soldiers with experience could command higher wages. These shifts were contested in statutes and courts. English laws attempted to fix wages, to tie labourer to lord's price. French officials likewise tried to arrest the drift in market bargaining power. Enforcement was partial. When you survey the countryside through your imagination, you should not see immovable ranks, but a population improvising within constraints. Small gains here and there, setting one family up to fare better than its neighbours during the next lean season or the next levy. In the early 1350s, the Black Prince, Edward of Woodstock, eldest son of Edward III, emerged as a captain whose name appealed to men who liked emblems and victories. Yet his reputation was built not simply on battlefield triumphs, but on his ability to keep his retinues together with contracts honoured and supplies organised. In Gascony and Languedoc, his campaigns combined the old chevauchée logic with targeted sieges. You might think of his camp not as a scene of inspirational speeches, but as a place where quartermasters counted sacks of flour and stretched them a few days more by mixing in ground beans, where scribes kept rosters and tallies, and where the prince's household officers, trained as much in administration as in courtesy, nudged a war machine forward in even steps. The capture of John II made a treaty inevitable, but not quick. Negotiations were thick with clauses, territorial transfers. The status of Aquitaine enlarged to a sovereign principality under English sway, the precise instalments of the king's ransom, and the hostages to secure good faith. Each clause represented a gamble against the future, as well as a payment for the past. English envoys wanted a settlement that would reduce their need to intervene constantly on the continent to defend a vassal land. French envoys wanted to limit the damage while conceding what a captive king could not deny. Throughout, interpreters and legal scholars earned their bread, as did the notaries who wrote elegant hands in Latin and French to capture what was agreed. While diplomats wrote, the countryside insisted on making itself heard. The free companies prolonged the sense of emergency. Town watchmen slept badly because rumour travelled faster than riders. Markets adjusted to unpredictability. Prices rose and fell with news. Merchants hoarded or risked consignments depending on their reading of the moment. In this way, the war taught large numbers of people how to consider policy as personal. A treaty was not just a matter of distant men's dignity. It was a question of whether a family might grind grain in safety next month, or whether a garrison would levy another round of purveyance before moving on. By 1357, it was evident that a settlement might still be years away and that, in the meantime, governance had to continue. The Dauphin navigated between force and negotiation, learning about the human materials of a kingdom while never far from the shadow of failure. He would be king in time, and his style, cautious, reformist, attentive to the reliability of institutions and the quiet competence of subordinates, grew in the climate of necessity. For you, it is instructive to watch him consider a map differently than his father had done. He saw not just battlefields, but tax districts, not just fortresses, but river systems, and he trained his eye on a France that would recover if its arteries could be cleared of predatory men and its treasury, given time to refill, stand again at your window of imagination and ask a small question that leads to a larger one. When the contract that supports a war says a payment is due on the first of a month, And when the men who are supposed to bring that payment are late because a bridge is down or a fare was thin of buyers, what does a captain do on the second day? Does he wait, discipline his men's appetite and watch his reputation for generosity decay? Or does he quietly allow them a license to live off the country, risking the hate of villages whose goodwill he will need when winter comes? If this seems like a small administrative problem, remember that a kingdom is built out of 100,000 such problems, and that in 1357, with a king in captivity and clerks more tired than anyone admits, France's solution set was narrower than it seemed from any gilded chair. If the treaty that people spoke of in corridors was coming, would it arrive in time to keep the free companies from becoming a way of life? You pick up the thread at a table. It is covered with parchment, inkstands, and wax seals, because the story for the moment belongs to men who write. The Treaty of Bretigny, concluded in 1360 and ratified at Calais, did not end the idea of the 100 Years' War so much as it locked one of its doors and opened another. If you trace the clauses with your finger, if you read the style of the legal French, smoothed by notaries who took pride in exactness, you will understand that peace meant administration. Territory in southwestern France, expanded and clarified, was to be held by the English crown in full sovereignty, no longer as a fief owing homage. The ransom for King John II was set in impressive sums, to be paid in installments, secured by hostages of high rank. It is a dignified arrangement if you are far away from the roads where coins must actually travel. Terms that look straightforward to a jurist, however, look like logistics to a household. To pay large ransoms, taxes must be collected. To collect taxes, officials must be trusted or feared. And to make officials effective, the countryside must be quiet enough that their horses are not taken, their letters not lost. The Dauphin, now King Charles V after his father's eventual death, approached these necessities with the temperament of a repairman. He did not seek glory, he sought solvency. The coinage was stabilized by careful management, less spectacular than a victory, but far more nourishing to those who counted their day's work by honest exchange. He surrounded himself with men who liked lists, bureaucrats, lawyers, and engineers whose sense of pride lay in what functioned at last after years of strain. Meanwhile, England had to decide what to make of its extension in France. The enlarged principality around Aquitaine required a prince, and the Black Prince was the obvious candidate. He took up rule in Bordeaux with a household that combined chivalric courtesy with practical governance, mixing tournaments with tallying. There is a steady detail you should not ignore. A sovereign must either delegate or drown. The Black Prince delegated to seneschals, to marshals, to tax officials, and to notaries to staff the courts. Each of these men brought habits with him, and from habits come institutions. Customs on wine exports were enforced. Adjudications in commercial disputes were issued. Garrisons were paid, mostly, on schedule, the mostly being a small hinge on which later troubles would turn. Peace did not mean that soldiers became farmers. Some did, but many joined the free companies that had made a living in the interstices of truce. Now these routiers organized themselves more cleverly, read the terrain of politics, and sold their absence at a price. Town councils bargained, bishops negotiated. Princes hired the same men they condemned when their wages ran out. You would find in a ledger from a minor abbey a line item that reads in some equivalent of Latin or French, "Money paid so that God's house might be left in peace for a season." That is a terrible sentence if you think about it under a candle in a cold scriptorium. Yet such sentences are how you keep daily bread for the brothers. The Black Prince's principality faced an arithmetic problem by the late 1360s. Governance costs money. Parades do not pay for themselves. When the prince took on a campaign in Spain to back Pedro of Castile, another of those complicated feudal entangled commitments, he financed it by levying a hearth tax in Aquitaine. To the prince's council, a hearth tax was an equitable, administratively simple way to raise a fixed sum. Count the chimneys, apply the rate, collect. To the people assessed, It was an imposition that cut into chests that still remembered famine. Every tax has an afterlife in resentment. Protests rose to legal arguments about feudal obligations, about whether the tax exceeded the customary bounds of lordship. Appeals were made to the King of France as feudal overlord. Here, the careful architecture of Bretigny was put under pressure in the place where it was weakest, the junction between grand sovereignty and local custom. Charles V, who read maps and laws with equal pleasure, found room to wedge a crowbar. He commissioned the Breton captain Bertrand du Guesclin and others like him to conduct a war not of heroic set pieces but of attrition, siegecraft, and steady reclamation. Du Guesclin did not look like a showpiece knight. He looked like a man who could wear men out by not making mistakes. Town by town, castle by castle, the French crown recovered positions by encouraging appeals from inside English-held lands, by pressing on supply lines, and by making every English garrison the nucleus of a budgetary headache. In your mind's ear, listen to the sound of pickaxes at a sapping trench, the murmur of men in a guardroom counting the days until pay arrives, and the sigh of a commander reading a letter from Bordeaux that promises funds next month, always next month. English strategic advantage had always depended on the sea, but the sea is only useful when the money to float ships is steady and when the weather participates. Piracy blurred with war as Norman, Breton, Castilian, and even Basque mariners cut at English convoys. The government in London leaned on the wool customs again. Merchants, sensing risk, demanded higher protections and sometimes stayed home. Calais remained a bridgehead, but beyond the pale of Calais lay a France that grew more confident. The castle that had been easy to supply in 1361 with a single convoy became a nervous post in 1368, reliant on escorts and the hope that an enemy patrol might miss its timing by a tide. Charles V's reforms were not dramatic. He restructured taxation with an eye to regularity. He invested in artillery, not to produce a single cataclysmic moment, but to thicken the ordinary business of sieges with more reliable pressure. He supported a bureaucracy that liked doing the same correct thing day after day. You could make a story from this that would not keep a child awake, but would explain why towns changed flags. A besieged place measuring out grain might accept terms of surrender that preserved property, civic privilege, and lives, especially if the besiegers had a reputation for keeping their side of the bargain. Reputation, in war as in trade, is a capital. In Aquitaine, the Black Prince's health declined. Gout and other ailments made his presence less constant. Absence matters. Subordinates who could call themselves his men when he was seen riding through a gate began to consider their own calculations when he was months away in Bordeaux or in bed. Local lords who had balanced loyalties found that French agents were offering terms not unlike those they remembered from before the treaty, with the added value of a crown that under Charles V paid more punctually than one might expect. In this way, each little choice, whether to answer a summons, to host a small French force for a night, to write to an English seneschal about taxes, tilted the board subtly until the accumulation of small weights made a large shift appear inevitable. The English crown had additional troubles. Edward III aged. Younger sons needed places and incomes. The politics of court and parliament absorbed attention and coin. The parliament in England, growing in confidence, demanded accounting for taxes and war aims. This was healthy for a kingdom's balance, but not always helpful for a sustained offensive abroad. Under scrutiny, every campaign must be justified. And when the returns diminish, legislatures grow reluctant. You can imagine the speeches, not fiery but earnest, with country knights concerned about levies in their shires, merchants worried about convoy protection, and clerics mindful of tithes that had to stretch to poor. Relief in parishes with too many orphaned children since the plague years. The idea of sovereignty, crafted at Bretigny, English kings as sovereigns in Aquitaine, owing no homage, proved unstable when tested against the lived world of oaths, legal memories, and commercial habits. French law courts provided avenues for appeal. French diplomacy provided reasons to use them. And the consistent pressure of a reformed French military system provided the environment in which legal arguments on parchment became facts on the ground. Towns that had found comfort in English customs privileges now found new comfort in the promise of lower exactions or better defense offered by the French crown. The balance sheet mattered in every counting house, and if the column under security glowed more brightly in one direction, councillors took note. By the late 1360s, the peace had developed all the symptoms of a war managed by other means. Skirmishes were frequent. Sieges reappeared with dreary regularity. Free companies sold their services to the best payer, and the princes wrote letters that tried to dress necessity as principle. If you find this anticlimactic, you are learning history's rhythm. Wars rarely turn on a single hinge. They pivot slowly on many. Charles de Mauritius' France recovered not by miracle but by institutions that did their work. The English position in southwestern France shrank because arithmetic and time were on the other side. At each fortress regained, a clerk wrote an inventory. A new garrison commander took possession and wrote to his superiors about the state of the walls. A tax official scheduled the levies to pay for the improvements. A canon at the local cathedral added a thanksgiving to the liturgy. There is boredom in victory, but it is the kind that keeps your children fed. For a moment, look again at Calais, the earlier prize. It stayed English through all this, fortified and settled by families who thought of themselves as townsfolk first, and only dimly as exiles on a foreign shore. The town became a place of habits, English law administered in French streets, merchants picking a side not by passion but by currency, and soldiers who married into local families and learned to speak across languages with a competence born of necessity. Calais is an exception that proves the rule that most territories change hands when the sum of small conveniences aligns with a larger authority. It persisted because it provided too much convenience to English trade to be abandoned, and because it was compact enough to be supplied even in hard moments. A big island can still hold a small outpost if the sea lane can be held. When Charles V died in 1380, he left a kingdom more coherent than the one he had assumed. He left also a war transformed. No longer a simple contest of claims, it had become a contest between styles of government, one that could maintain pressure and tolerable finances against one that, for reasons of politics and distance, could not hold every peace it wished to keep. The Black Prince had died in 1376, and Edward III followed in 1377, leaving the English crown to a boy. Richard II, child kings are not always a curse, but they are always a test for the people around them. Councils gain power, factions test each other, and the clarity of purpose that comes from a single will is replaced by negotiation around a cradle. If you measure story one by the claim with which it began, the right of an English king to hold French lands without humiliation, you can call the Treaty of Bretigny a resolution. It was a moment when lawyers' pens overcame lances. But if you measure it by the title that frames our long night, the entire story of the 100 Years' War, you will understand that we have closed only the first drawer in a chest of papers. The clauses of 1360 did not erase memory, and they did not satisfy those whose interests were touched by the next tax. The next convoy threatened, the next wheat price spiking in a market because a road was unsafe. You can ask, as you lie still and breathe slowly, when a peace depends on the dutiful delivery of coins along roads that need repair, and when the men who carry those coins are tired, and the walls that guard the route are held by soldiers whose pay is late, how long can careful French and careful English hold a shape that rain and time and hunger push against? I will begin story 2 with that question in mind, because what came next was less about kings and more about the long, ordinary endurance of people who kept their houses upright even when flags changed above them. You start in a market square that looks ordinary if you don't look too closely. A line of baskets holds onions and apples. Wool sacks lean against the wall of a timber-framed house. A notary sits at a portable desk with a horn of ink and a knife for sharpening quills. You hear the bell for the mid-morning mass and the chatter of buyers who compare the price of bread to what it cost last week. Nothing you see is dramatic, and yet almost every exchange is quietly connected to the war. Because what people buy, what they sell, and what they are told to hand over to the crown determines whether an army can move or whether it must wait one more week for carts and horses. You find that musters are not just lists of men. They are also lists of goods, and that a kingdom's strength is measured not only in lances but in loaves. If this is boring, it is the right kind of boring to understand the century ahead. To assemble an English army for France in the 1330s and 1340s, sheriffs received writs that read more like shopping lists than like heroic summonses. They were told how many carts to procure, how many oxen, how many barrels of ale, how many bow staves, how many sheaves of arrows. They leaned on villages to provide them, paying sometimes in cash and sometimes on credit that would take months or years to clear. A carpenter with a good hand for wheel rims would find himself contracted to repair wagons. A tanner would be asked for harness leather. A brewer would be warned to keep casks ready for the king's men. The army that sailed with Edward III did not begin at a port. It began in workshops and byres and malt houses. Nothing about the work felt like glory. It felt like obligation, with a hope that fair compensation would follow and a fear that it would not. Across the Channel, in the French king's domain, the same logic ran in a different vocabulary. The arrière-ban was a general call to arms, a reminder of the obligations that vassals owed to their sovereign. Town councils checked their lists of eligible men. Lords called their tenants. Guilds supplied crossbows and bolts to outfit watchmen who would spend more time on walls than on open fields. Between towns and countryside, toll stations took their due on carts crossing bridges, so the king's officers knew who moved grain and when, and could intervene when supplies mattered more for sieges than for markets. Taxes, named tiles and aids, trickled and sometimes surged from household purses into coffers, then out again to pay wages or to buy salt meat and flour for garrisons. If you want to hear war, sit by the counting table and listen to the coins counted into bags. That rhythm kept men marching. You should picture an archery practice on a Sunday afternoon in an English village. The church has let out. The men and older boys gather at the butts beyond the fields. The parish constable, or reeve, makes sure they attend. They dip fingers into resin to grip bowstrings better. They test their stance with the same awkwardness you might feel when learning a motion that will become automatic with repetition. Meanwhile, a statute somewhere is posted that discourages excessive play at football or dice and urges men to practice archery instead. The policy is not romantic. It is practical. A realm with practiced archers will have a known resource to draw on, measurable in sheaves of arrows and in men who have calluses where the string bites. Those calluses are an administrative asset. In coastal towns, families came to understand that their livelihoods were bound up in the war's ebb and flow, even if they never saw a battlefield. In Bordeaux, factors for English merchants argued with municipal officers about quay dues. In London's wool market, a broker in a sober cloak discussed the year's clip with a countryman who smelled of lanolin and damp. People in Flemish towns watched for ships from across the Channel because English wool fed their looms, and their looms fed their bellies. A delay because of raiders, a storm in the Channel, a customs dispute that held back sacks in a warehouse. All of these were felt on weavers' benches and in bakers' ovens. The work of law turned into the work of hunger or comfort more quickly than anyone liked to admit. In France, the king's agents did something that looked dull but mattered acutely. They kept lists of who owed what, where salt was stored, where mills stood, which bridges needed repair, and which towns had walls in need of pointing. Because salt preserved meat and fish, and because fish days were many in the church calendar, the crown's reach into salt shaped daily diets and thus shaped politics. A salt merchant with a ledger and a guard with a spear at a warehouse gate could influence mood in a parish more than a captain on a horse 100 miles away. The words of tax edicts and salt regulations lack color until you imagine a housewife scraping the bottom of a jar and deciding whether to complain to the parish priest or to a neighbor whose cousin sits on the town council. Even in places far from the main routes, the war appeared as a pattern of small interruptions. A village mill might be seized for a week by a passing company with a captain who swore he would compensate the miller and then rode away before the tally could be agreed. A bridgekeeper might be ordered to waive tolls for the king's carts and make up the shortfall by charging locals a little more until tempers rose at the tavern. A parish beadle could be told to beat the bounds not for tradition this year, but to show a commissioner the limits of the fields that would be assessed for a levy. These acts were not grand. They were sand in gears. They made a housewife's list longer and a smallholder's temper shorter. When men mustered, they came with their villages behind them. A retinue contract listed a knight, some esquires, a group of mounted archers, a complement of servants and grooms. In practice, this looked like a miniature economy moving through the countryside. Blacksmiths were busy for days before, repairing horseshoes and sharpening blades. Cobblers stitched and restitched soles. Women washed and re-washed linen because clean cloth mattered to health long before anyone knew the words for microbes. The mustering field had its own market, with food sellers and alewives who could smell opportunity from a mile away. You might picture the orderly line of men being counted and tested, but you should also picture the half-circle of stalls around them, skewers turning over coals, and a boy carrying a bucket of water to his mother because she could not leave her place behind the table where she sold pottage to a soldier who would be gone by morning. The English crown relied on purveyance, the right to take goods at set prices for royal service. The word sounds tidy. The practice was not. A purveyor with a badge and a parchment could walk into a granary and write in his book how much he would take. He could promise a price that would be paid in due course and then move on. When the money was late, a family learned to stretch barley with peas and to salt less meat for winter. In French lands, similar demands came under other names, and the effect was the same. The crown's need turned into a household's arithmetic. Sometimes the village headman could negotiate, leaning on a cousin in the town council. Sometimes he could not, and the levy went ahead, and the midwife listened to more women worry that their milk would be thin. Siege seasons taught towns to think like accountants. Before a siege, you ordered as much grain as you could store, you made an inventory of salt fish and cheese, and you checked your wells. You gathered timber to repair engines or gates, and you inspected your crossbow strings. A good crossbow was useless if its string snapped from damp. A good baker was useless if flour ran out. A good watch system was useless if the watch bells were not oiled and could not be heard across the quarters in fog. The details multiplied. Spare pickaxes for the men who would have to fill a breach. Tar and old cloth for fire pots. Ladders measured to the exact height of the inner walls. Candles for night watches. A clear posting of the penalties for hoarding, so that men who tried to profit in siege would fear more than they desired. When the Black Death arrived, it entered this world of lists and routines like a wolf into a fold. Men stopped showing up at musters because they were dead or because their households could not spare them. Women found themselves running tasks formerly assigned to men, and many proved as competent as their husbands, which the records admit in their own way by naming them as contractors or as widows liable for taxes. Fields went untilled. Toll stations stood quiet. Workshops closed because the apprentice had buried the master and could not take orders on his own yet. Governments tried to hold the lines of expectation. They ordered wages fixed, demanded labor at customary rates, and insisted that tolls and taxes still be paid. The disease did not care. Communities learned to do less with fewer hands and to choose which obligations to meet and which to let slide until a sheriff's temper cooled or a lord's attention wandered. The chevauchée, the mounted raids that became a signature of English field strategy, were comprehensible to ordinary people not as flags on the horizon, but as smoke. You saw a line of smoke and then another, and you counted how many barns the day could lose before panic turned to flight. You hurried the cattle into the forest if you had time. You shoved sacks into a ditch and prayed the raiders would miss them. You sent your youngest to the church with a relic and a candle if you had one. The raiders were contracted men, not brigands, but under orders that expected them to take what they could not carry and burn what they could not take. A mill's wooden works burned fast and ate a district's patience for a year. The raiders were not the only danger. Behind them came months of hunger and years of legal pleadings to reduce levies because a harvest lost in one season repeated its pain in the next. Within towns, peace or war, the assize of bread and ale, the set of regulations that fixed quality and price, was enforced with scales and measures. When grain was scarce, the weight of the lawful loaf could be lowered to keep the price steady. The housewife who noticed loaves shrinking felt the war in her hands as surely as a soldier felt it in his shoulders. Bakers were watched, scolded, and fined. Alewives were inspected for strength and purity. The inspector's rod measured less than a yard but carried the crown's full ambition to keep streets calm. Such enforcement mattered because hungry crowds were as dangerous as enemy scouts. Constables knew this, and governors of towns learned to send word to neighboring markets when supplies ran thin, hoping to entice traders with safe conduct and a good price. Port towns like Calais, once seized and settled, discovered that a garrison's presence rerouted lives. Children grew up learning a second language in the alleyways, and soldiers married into local families who learned to measure their days by the rhythm of guard changes and convoy arrivals. The staple and institutional device designed to channel wool exports through a single monitored point meant that officials with seals and tables filled warehouses with bales that had to be guarded against damp and mice. Clothiers sent agents, brokers counted bales, scribes noted weights and marks. The work could feel endless, but its predictability created security in the minds of those who lived under its shadow. You might consider this dull machinery oppressive. For many, it was also a reason to believe tomorrow would look like today. The free companies, bands of soldiers unattached to a particular employer, were a vocabulary you learned to speak if you lived outside great walls. A village's answer to the arrival of one such band depended on coin. If the chest in the church had been kept full by careful alms and prudent stewarding, you could pay for a short season of peace. If the chest was light, you tried to bargain with food or with promises. Sometimes a nearby lord would gather men to oppose the band. Sometimes he would negotiate, preferring a quiet loss to a loud ruin. In every case, memory kept the score. If a parish had paid this year, it would expect a lighter hand next year, and if the promise was not honoured, the chronicle of grievance lengthened, and the mood turned from appeasement to ambush. For all the weight of war, ordinary rhythms persisted stubbornly. You milked and mucked, you brewed and baked. You tended to the sick and buried the dead. You celebrated a wedding with a roast if you could afford one, and with a pottage if you could not. In English shires, quarter sessions sat and heard cases. In French bailliages, officers toured and dispensed a version of justice. Priests baptized. Notaries recorded dowries. Guilds admitted apprentices. Children learned to thatch and to tally, to spin and to set snares, and when men in livery colours marched through the lane, children learned to watch from doorways and to keep out of reach. War became a season among others with its own chores and its own prayers. Yet it is not right to pretend that people became numb. The sight of returning men with scars, the sound of bells tolling for the plague dead, the bizarre quiet of a market after a raid, these changed communities in ways that do not enter the narrow lines of account books. Some places depopulated and never recovered their old size. Others absorbed new families from ruined districts and changed their dialects and their sense of themselves. The war taught improvisation. Hedges became defences. Barns became barracks. Wells were bricked over and hidden to keep raiders from poisoning them. Parish chests were double-locked. Roads were avoided at certain hours. Every practice had a story behind it, and each story was about learning to survive where sovereignty wavered. The crown's men understood that legitimacy was a daily maintenance task. Royal letters with grand seals needed local voices to make them trustworthy. So sheriffs, seneschals, and prévôts cultivated relationships with abbots and merchants, with aldermen and guild wardens. They sent letters ahead to announce collections. They softened language when a town had suffered. They made examples when a district defied. Behind these calculations was a deeper knowledge that kings won and lost more in the patience of their subjects than in a single field. The 100 Years' War would be made year after year in these slow exchanges, and the people who managed them would never be famous. And yet they would decide which army could march and which would stall at the edge of a river, because the barges had not arrived. If you close your eyes and listen to this first stretch of the century, you hear not trumpets, but the sounds of industry, the thump of loaves turned out of ovens, the splash of oars at a ferry landing, the rasp of a file on an arrowhead, the creak of a cart axle that needs grease, the murmur of a clerk reading a list in a low voice while a reeve nods and stares at his own fingers as if they might hold back the tally. These are the sounds of endurance. They are what stood between households and hunger, between towns and panic, between kings and failure. And if you let your mind rest on one face, a baker's wife counting out loaves for soldiers' rations, a shepherd watching a column pass and deciding whether to drive his flock to the marsh, a parish priest balancing his fear of the plague with his duty to the dying, you begin to see that the line between war and peace is thinner and more permeable than slogans admit. Now, before the section ends, allow yourself one simple question that reaches farther than this market square. When plague thins the ranks of the living, when tax collectors knock more often, when raiders light barns in a line across the horizon, and when kings promise that a treaty will quiet things soon, what habits do you teach your children so that they can sleep? Do you teach them to count loaves or to count arrows, to listen for bells or to listen for hooves, to trust letters with seals or to trust the road that slips through the forest behind the mill? In the next section, we will follow how those habits deepened and hardened as the century wore on, and how communities learned to survive. Not just a single campaign, but the long aftertaste of promises kept imperfectly in peace that never quite held, move forward into a quieter decade that is not really quiet at all. Treaties have been signed, seals have been pressed into green wax, ambassadors have bowed, and yet the work that sustains war goes on beneath the veneer of peace. You watch a clerk in a town hall copy out the text of a hearth tax, counting chimneys with a neat script. You see a seneschal in an Aquitanian town convene men to confirm accounts for garrisons that never quite have enough coin. You note a village beadle reading out a royal ordinance that fixes wages at rates some men have already begun to exceed because there are not enough hands for all the work that must be done. The promise of peace after the treaty feels like a lid placed on a pot that hasn't stopped boiling. The sound you hear is a long simmer, occasional rattle, constant heat. The so-called peace brings a new kind of arithmetic into kitchens. Hearth taxes, poll taxes, aids, tiles, each has a name and a logic that officials can explain. Each takes a portion of what households thought of as theirs. You watch a mother in a stone cottage sort coins on a rough table while a child fidgets, and a pot bubbles on the hearth. She has a simple calculation to make. How much to give the collector today? How much to set aside for the next market day? How much to hide against the return of a company that might be more insistent than the king's men? These are not crimes. They are tactics of survival, the same sort of tactics that a garrison captain uses when he stretches biscuit one more day or a quartermaster waters wine to keep men quiet. Until the wagons arrive, beyond domestic arithmetic lies the arithmetic of legitimacy. After plague and campaigns, men who stand at a counting table have to persuade their neighbors that the sums are fair enough. In France, under a cautious king and councillors who liked order, coinage is trimmed and then corrected, debased, and then reformed. Each turn of policy sending ripples through market stalls where prices are argued over in low voices. In England, the government leans on customs, the wool subsidy, the wine duties, so often that merchants begin quietly to build in a risk price for doing business with the crown. You overhear it in the way they phrase promises. Payment at Michaelmas, God willing and the customs flowing. Such phrases sound pious, but they are just careful. Free companies do not disappear because treaties exist. They change their routes and their tone and learn to sell time and absence as commodities. A captain who once boasted of the villages he burned now boasts of the roads he will not patrol if a district pays him to stay away. In a priory scriptorium, a cellarer adds a line to his account. Money paid for the protection of the wheat harvest. Linen exchanged for the return of a kidnapped lay brother. Butter sent as a gift to a small garrison whose captain has hinted he prefers gifts to violence. The cellarer's script is tidy, the lines even. The reality behind the script is uneasy. You sense the monastery's investment shifting from books to bolting doors. Urban life absorbs these pressures differently. A town guild hall holds a meeting on a damp evening, candles guttering while masters and wardens decide how to share out a levy. They whisper about the new ordinance that says cloth must be measured to a standard, dyed to a regulated depth, and sealed by the owl-nager before it can be sold. Regulation feels heavy, but it also protects. Merchants will come if they trust that measures are fair, that dyes will not bleed, that weights will not lie. The war years have taught towns to worship predictability. As you watch, a weaver raises a practical objection. If soldiers seize a batch of cloth on the road, who bears the loss? His question is met with a rule about insurance, about sharing risk through the guild chest, and about reminding carriers to travel with letters of safe conduct. The safe conduct is just a piece of parchment with a seal. It has no iron in it. Its strength lies in whether a captain on the road fears the prince who issued it more than he wants the cloth. Along the coasts, fishermen count days of fair weather and nights of safe harbours differently now. Naval power, once a matter of oared galleys in the hands of allies, becomes a game of convoys, letters of marque, and decisions about whether a ship's cargo is lawful prize or theft. A family in a port town measures its fortunes in casks of herring and in the luck of a convoy escaping interception at a narrow channel. Through your mind's eye passes a docket at a vice-admiralty court. Testimony about a capture at sea, estimates of a hull's worth, disputes over whether the captured skipper raised the wrong flag or uttered the wrong words at boarding. None of this feels like knights in bright harness. It feels like men arguing over a ledger, where water stains blur sums and signatures. In border regions and contested lands, such as the marches between English-held territories and the rest of France, villagers become adept at reading the sky for more than weather. Smoke on the horizon means a chevauchée even in truce time. Hooves in the night mean a scouting party. You learn to hide grain in a pit lined with straw and covered with a thin layer of earth. You learn to take the iron strap from the mill's cog at the first ring of alarm so that a seizing garrison cannot make the wheel turn. These practices become tradition, taught by fathers to sons, by mothers to daughters, preserved in whispered suggestions passed to new in-laws over bread and broth. You see how skills born of emergency settle into culture, how communities become repositories of low, practical magic, how to make doors look locked when they are not, how to leave a path that looks like the only one when it is not, how to say yes in a tone that means no. The church, so present in earlier decades as a keeper of rites and registers, now provides not only sacraments but a kind of moral accounting for a world that pays because it must and lies because it fears. Parish priests preach patience and denounce extortion with a careful grammar that blames the sin but fears naming the sinner. Confraternities organize processions that beg for rain or for peace. hospitals continue their quiet, exhausted work. The Great Schism divides allegiance at the top of the hierarchy, but at the level where candles are lit and confessions are heard, the schism is experienced as a slightly altered wording in prayers and a little confusion about which name is declared during a Mass. For the people who must eat and sleep, the practical question about the Church is whether it will continue to be a creditor who forgives or a landlord who insists. At a chapter meeting, canons debate whether to loosen the rents because the harvest failed, or whether to tighten them because the treasury is thin. They choose differently in different places, and their reputations grow accordingly. In England, the labour laws written after the plague continue to rub against the reality of a shrunken workforce. Manor courts hear cases of men and women accused of taking higher wages than the statute allows. Stewards and jurors listen. Plaintiffs and defendants talk past each other. Fines are levied that some pay and others evade. You sit in the corner of a hall where such a court sits and watch how law and practice conduct their slow duel. A reeve knows that if he pushes too hard, he will see a cottage empty next season, because the family will have moved to a town where guilds protect them, or to another manor where the steward is laxer or more humane. Mobility changes the bargaining. Feet become arguments, moving away from strict lords to tolerant ones, leaving behind fields that stand fallow and accounts that do not balance. City life in Paris or Rouen or York adjusts to garrisons as a weather condition. In a street near the walls, you see a line of women with pitchers at a fountain. Their talk is about wash days, children's coughs, and the price of lamp oil. It turns to soldiers only when wages fall in arrears and a few men drink too much, or when a captain posts a notice limiting tavern hours after sunset. Tavern keepers pin ordinances to a beam with a nail that has already held 3 such papers in the last year. Ordinances regulate noise, wood sales, and prices for cooked meats. It seems petty until you recognize their purpose, to reduce the friction of bodies crowded together under strain. Every rule scratched into cheap paper and nailed to a beam is a prayer for a little less trouble in the night. In the Southwest, where English authority must be purchased daily with attention, the Black Prince's council and then his successors' officers learn that legal forms matter as much as lances. They insist on collecting hearth taxes. They summon cities to recognize decisions handed down in Bordeaux. In return, towns bring lawsuits citing old privileges and friendships with prior kings, and appeal across boundaries when convenient. Courts become battlegrounds where language is the weapon. A notary writes a long sentence that ties custom to mercy and tax to protection, integrating the town's pride with the crown's needs with a phrase that can be translated as "for the public good." You linger on those words because they repeat everywhere. In England's parliaments, when shire knights ask why wool subsidies are high if convoys are poor, in France's estates, when townsmen ask why tile have not been lowered now that a treaty supposedly brings relief. The public good, like peace, is an object moved by words across tables where men argue in measured tones. Meanwhile, there is youth. Boys turn into men in a world where wearing a badge on a sleeve ties them to a house that can feed them, where a captain's livery is a promise of bread and a little coin. Retinues grow like vines up the walls of important households. A livery jacket is a uniform and a ticket to survival. You watch a boy hesitate at a gate where such men stand guard. You see him square his shoulders and ask whether the steward is hiring. He will learn to stand watch, to oil a haubergeon, to card wool in winter, to keep accounts if he can form his letters, to carry messages if he can ride, to serve wine with the right bow. Service is a ladder. The distance between the foot and the next rung is measured by competence and discretion. In peacetime, a household like this is a school for patience. In wartime, it is an army that can be called from a dining hall as easily as from a field. You might expect that after so much learning in the 1350s, the views of the countryside from raids, the scarcity of plague years, towns and lords would find a lasting balance. and sometimes they did. A town in Burgundy negotiates a permanent rate of tax in exchange for maintaining its walls. A coastal village secures a charter that confirms its right to levy a small fee for the upkeep of its harbour. A monastery agrees to a fixed rent with peasants so that both sides can plan harvests without surprises. These compacts dull friction, but they also fossilize it in new shapes. A new generation grows up thinking that a certain tithe is natural. It forgets the argument that produced it. When another crisis comes, it treats the compact as a sacred thing rather than a crafted compromise, and the old willingness to bargain is harder to find. In the later years of the century, faction and illness afflict kingship in France, and governance becomes a relay race between councillors. The weight of administration falls more heavily on those who can keep the machine moving. Treasurers who understand that late pay means disorder. Marshals who understand that soldiers without work become bandits. Lawyers who understand that if courts do not sit, men will settle quarrels with cudgels. You observe that when royal attention turns inward, ordinary people rely even more on themselves. They reinforce hedges, they dredge ditches, they mend bridges, they keep caches of grain, they hide coins in places that children are warned never to touch. Villages turn into small republics of precaution, not because they have lost faith in kings, but because they have learned where kings cannot reach quickly. In England, the burden of repeated levies produces whispers that harden into speeches. Poll taxes, a flat charge on each person, feel especially sharp to the poor because they ignore the facts of hunger and harvest. You stand at the edge of a green in a market town and listen to men complain, not with the language of ideology, but with the language of arithmetic and dignity. How can a household with 2 hands and 3 small mouths pay the same as a household with 4 hands and no small mouths? The complaint climbs a ladder of logic. If we must pay the same, then do we not deserve to speak the same? A constable hears this and frowns. He is a neighbour and a servant of the law. He does not relish choosing. The compromise he reaches in his heart is to be strict with strangers and soft with those whose babies he has seen baptized. This is not policy, but it is peace. And it explains why some towns keep their tempers when others flare. Trade, despite everything, inches upward in corridors where risk can be managed. Clothiers in England experiment with finishing their own cloth rather than exporting raw wool. Wine merchants in Gascony maintain their contacts in English ports. Salt from Atlantic marshes and saltpeter for gunpowder begin to share warehouse space in certain towns, each in its own sacks, each labelled in a hand that grows more standard across regions. You notice the beginnings of a new habit. Men carry notebooks, not just loose leaves. Stitched gatherings of paper protect lists and teach minds to think of accounts as durable. A merchant's son learns to tie a knot and to align columns, skills his grandfather would have admired without calling them learning. Artillery begins to speak more loudly. For towns and castles, this means stocking powder and shot and learning to fear a new kind of thunder. Gun founders and bell founders are sometimes the same men, their skills transferable between voices of warning and voices of devotion. In a smithy, a boy helps lift a mould. He will grow into a man who can cast a small gun for a lord, and he will count as progress that he is paid on time and that the piece does not burst. This technology pushes the war towards sieges that rely less on starving a place into submission and more on battering a breach. The change is slow and uneven, but even the rumor of it alters choices. A town that once felt safe behind old walls begins to save for bastions. A lord once content with a high tower begins to think about thick earth and low angles. You can almost hear the thinking in the silence after a prayer in a council chamber. Can we manage the cost of a new gun the same way we manage the cost of a new bridge? Through all this, night falls each day. Families bank fires, shutters are closed, locks are set, and a watchman's cry is heard more or less regularly, depending on whether the town has hired enough men. At night, fear is smaller and bigger at once. Smaller because you can do nothing but sleep. Bigger because imagination invents hoofbeats and ladders against walls. Parents teach children to recognize a friendly knock and to ignore the crunch of a cart on the road at late hours. They whisper the names of saints and the names of neighbors who can be trusted. And in the late hours, men who keep accounts count the same sums again to see whether their minds have made a mistake and discovered a coin. The sums do not change. Sleep follows eventually because bodies insist. If you gather these scenes, the clerk copying a tax, the weaver debating a standard, the fisherman listening for the wind, the boy choosing a livery, the priest choosing a word, the captain choosing to wait one more day for pay, you begin to understand that the so-called peace of these years feels like work rather than rest.
It is a labor to keep going, a labor to balance hunger and hope.
A labor to decide whom to trust when flags change and words like public good and sovereign right float through rooms where people mostly want prices stable and children safe. And as the century closes with tempers frayed and the memory of plague never far, you are left with a small, practical question that prepares the ground for the next turn in the war. When promises to pay soldiers keep coming late, when towns are learning to build thicker walls, and when kings are pulled into disputes they cannot ignore, what happens to ordinary routines the next time a fleet gathers and drums beat across the channel? I will follow that sound into Section 3, where those routines meet new armies, new occupations, and the stubbornly familiar work of keeping a household upright under strange masters. You move into years when the word occupation changes, from a threat murmured in taverns to a routine printed on ordinances and posted on doors. The long century has taught everyone a language of caution. Now the words take on new grammar under new masters. In England, a new royal house settles in, Lancaster, bringing its own debts and promises. In France, a kingdom bends under the combined weight of a king's illness and the rivalries of princes who dress their grievances in noble rhetoric and then send men into streets and fields. You find, as always, that life goes on in the unglamorous acts, baking, bargaining, billet lists, and the arithmetic of how much a household can spare when both tax collectors and captain's servants knock. The clearest sound in your ear is the noise of a city under two governments at once. In Paris, guilds and councils measure themselves against princely factions. In Rouen later, a great town will discover what it means to be starved with method. Before those climaxes, daily life tightens by inches. A butcher hears that this year's levy will be a flat rate per head rather than tied to profits. He counts his family, then counts his coins, then looks at the hooks on which meat will hang, and despairs. A brewer hears that a convoy has been delayed by men who call themselves privateers, and finds that his barrels will not suffice to meet tavern demand if ships cannot dock on time. A carrier learns that a bridge toll has doubled because a lord's garrison must be maintained, and he must decide whether to pass the cost to customers or to walk the long way around and risk the forest. None of this makes headlines. All of it makes tempers. In France, the crown's troubles deepen into civil war when princes treat the realm's government like a private estate. Armagnacs and Burgundians sort men by colours on sleeves, and men sort their households by the same colours, since a badge can be the difference between a safe night and a door broken in by men who claim enforcement of a warrant. In these years, you learn how deeply a city's routines depend on who controls the gates after dark. Ordinances govern everything. When bakers may fire ovens, when butchers may slaughter, when taverns may pour, when carts may pass, which streets must be cleared for patrols, who may carry weapons, which parishes must contribute men to watches. The rules look fussy on parchment. They are lifelines in practice. Authority tries to reduce unpredictability to a dull hum rather than a shriek. In England, the succession from Richard II to Henry IV brings a quieter change. New men need income. Old obligations persist. Parliaments more confident, after a century of shared governance, ask what campaigns are worth and how convoys will be protected if taxes are voted. London's merchants bring measured complaints. County knights claim to speak for the shires. Clerics count tithes and calculate whether alms must be increased because of sickness and scarcity. You hear a reasonable tone in these debates, less pageantry, more bookkeeping, and you understand how a realm that pays attention to accounts is better prepared for misfortune than one that relies on exalted words. When storms close the channel or pirates trouble the sea lanes, customs revenues sag, and sheriffs send apologetic letters about shortfalls that parishioners will experience as a shortage of coin for poor relief or a delay in repairing a bridge. Civil war in France makes the countryside nervous in a new way. When enemies share a language and allegiance to the same king, their quarrels reach closer to homes. Mass is said with the same prayers regardless of faction. Market days continue, fairs open, and yet a rumour can empty a road in an hour. A cart that bears groceries for a town can suddenly become contraband if a group of men with daggers says so. Shopkeepers keep two sets of stories to explain where goods came from. One to please men with red crosses on their sleeves, one for men with white and black. Those who cannot tell neat stories learn to hide their stock and guard their tongues. Neutrality is not a virtue in these years. It is a method of survival expressed in practical choices. Which door to use, which alley to avoid, which saint's day to observe loudly and which quietly. Then a more familiar war returns, riding with banners and followed by accountants. In 1415, an English army gathers and crosses to France. You have learned by now that a crossing is not a flourish but a careful chain of supply. Cogs are hired. Purveyors sweep markets for biscuit and salted meat. Writs order arrows and bowstrings. Royal armourers inspect hauberks and sallets. Surgeons pack oils and bandages. Chaplains pack their missiles. For towns that provide men, the days before departure are a crammed calendar of chores, repairing shoes and harness, turning pigs into salted meat, mending tents, sharpening blades. Wives fold extra linen and tuck small amulets into purses. Mothers press bread into sons' hands and say nothing, because tears break composure, and composure is what's needed now. The siege of Harfleur begins as a geometry problem and ends as a lesson in health. English guns batter walls, miners sap, defenders countersap, and councillors inside count sacks of grain and argue about surrender terms. Dysentery spreads through the besiegers' camp, and you come to understand how a single river can dictate a campaign when latrines sit too close to water sources and drainage trenches clog. Surgeons cauterize, pray, and wash. Some advise boiled water. Many cannot enforce the advice. A town's fall is an exchange of ledgers. One garrison's wage list is replaced by another. One set of privileges and duties posted on the town hall gives way to another, stamped with a different seal, written in a slightly different hand, enforcing many of the same routines because walls, markets, and taxes must function regardless of sovereign. Agincourt follows like a paradox. The small, lucky English army wins its way home past angry garrisons and walled towns and survives a day that looks like a miracle to men who prefer clear stories with heroes and villains. To you, trained by this long telling, it is another example of logistics meeting terrain, of a commander who knows to narrow a field and put mud to work, of men who have practiced drawing heavy bows until their bodies answer without thought. The aftermath is again a matter of names on lists: the dead, the captives, the ransoms, the recompenses. Armies pass, and the next morning has to be cooked and washed and measured out in labour. Counties on both sides start counting all over again, because the war that returns after a great battle is the war of wages and walls, the conquest of Normandy. Beginning in 1417 feels different because it is thorough. The work is methodical. Towns isolated, bridges taken, roads patrolled, garrisons planted. Rouen, great and proud, learns what a siege is when men decide to starve a place without theatrics. Inside, magistrates calculate daily bread and decide how much to cut each loaf. The city expels mouths to save grain. The besiegers sometimes force them back to strip the city's store. Famine takes on the shapes you would rather not picture. Grass bread, thin soups, the selling of heirlooms for a handful of meal, the quiet sale of a silver spoon to a soldier's mistress who has coin because soldiers are still paid even when bakers are not. Clergy argue over whether to melt chalices to buy grain. Councillors issue ordinances to prevent hoarding, price gouging, and theft. Parents, quiet. Children at night, promising that the enemy will tire and leave, while knowing the enemy is not fatiguing so long as wagons arrive on their side. When Rouen yields, the English administration moves in with a force that looks like the most dangerous weapon of the age: paper. The Exchequer sits at Rouen with men who tally customs, tolls, fines, and rents. Courts sit and pronounce judgment in the old usages because continuity calms hearts. Proclamations confirm city privileges even as they change loyalties. Trade measures adjust. The mint stamps coins that will pass in markets because coins are the closest thing to peace most people see. Normandy learns a new calendar of remittance dates and a new hierarchy of officials to please. Bakers bake, coopers hoop barrels for wine and fish, boatmen learn to show the proper permit at the right moment to the right sergeant. English captains learn domestic rules they must follow to keep a region feeding their men. Occupation makes everyone a clerk. Paris, held by Burgundian favour and shared arrangements, experiences a different form of occupation, politics with sharpened edges. Councils declare loyalty. Officials in sober gowns regulate crowds. Foreign soldiers appear in shops as customers and in doorways as unwelcome shadows. Markets open under watch. Guilds receive new instructions. Sermons shift in tone. Ordinary people once again adjust their stories to match whoever is posted at the Châtelet. A rope maker continues to twist his 3 strands to the proper strength. A baker continues to keep his oven at the standard heat. A washerwoman continues to beat linen against a stone at the riverbank. Yet every errand goes through filters: which streets are safe, which colours are unwise to wear, which nights are best for staying inside. In English towns, the war reaches in a guarded pride. Victories are celebrated. River traffic changes. Wool shipments route through secure ports. Taxes are voted with arguments that sound practical. The coast must be guarded. Convoys must be funded. Garrisons must be supplied. Calais must be maintained.
Normandy must be made to pay for itself.
Parliaments examine accounts with growing competence, and auditors travel to inspect stores and make sure ties of favour have not turned into theft. If you listen during these years, you hear a bureaucratic music, rich in numbers and abbreviations, the sound of a state that trusts paper because it cannot be in all places at once. The farther an army campaigns, the more domestic governance must be trusted to men who like rules and who remember debts. Meanwhile, in the countryside, a farmer in both realms continues to care more about weather than proclamations. He watches the sky and the river's height. He hears rumors of raids and adjusts his work accordingly. He hides grain again in an old pit whose place is known to a few elders. He rethatches his barn with straw that does not gleam in a way that invites a scavenging eye. He teaches children to be silent when men in livery pass. His wife bargains with a soldier's laundress to exchange a little soap and a loaf for a news of when pay is coming to the nearest garrison, because pay days mean less theft and calmer nights. If you asked him to map the war, he would draw tracks between his house, the mill, the church, and the market, with new dots where gates now stand. His geography is small and exact. That is how people stay alive when maps are changing. If you stand at the end of this section and breathe slowly, you see the pattern. A century's lessons about tax, food, fear, coin, and the right thickness of walls are assembled into a statecraft that does not sleep much. Occupation is not only soldiers in streets. It is the steady insistence that bread be weighed, that tolls be paid, that courts sit, that days be predictable. In Normandy, clerks pay garrisons with receipts and set wheat prices so markets can open. In England, clerks budget rations for garrisons abroad and argue about tariffs. Everywhere, men and women watch the price of bread, because bread is where policy meets a table. With a treaty looming that will promise a unity of crowns, you are left with a practical question. When a proclamation says a king will govern 2 realms with 1 hand, what will you make for breakfast if one hand is late and the other takes your flour at the gate? You return to the table where men in soft shoes and good manners trace borders with quills and then send hard-handed men to make the lines true. The Treaty of Bretigny is fresh, the wax on its seals not yet brittle. The English king holds a widened domain in the southwest with claims to sovereign rights. The French king owes ransoms that outweigh his coin, secured by hostages who sit in comfortable captivity and turn their days into a discipline of patience. On the ground, this elegant structure depends on wagons moving through predictable roads, on fairs remaining open, on tax collectors meeting schedules. It depends also on a quieter consent, the willingness of towns to submit to levies in exchange for protection, the willingness of garrisons to enforce order without turning to disorder themselves. Free companies make a mockery of this stillness with their mobility. They have learned how to live in the friction between truce and war. Captains are businessmen with lances. Soldiers are contractors with bad tempers. They sell what they can, swords for hire, absence from districts that can pay for quiet, escort services for a merchant nervous about the road. When kings prefer not to use them, these companies spill into the countryside like a flood that recedes only when the land has paid a price. The French crown tries an idea that has the flavor of a clever friar's council: steer the companies out of the kingdom by hiring them for a campaign in Spain, where a dynastic quarrel promises both plunder and the satisfaction of sending trouble outward. You imagine the road south. Companies snaking toward the Pyrenees, guided by men who know passes and wells, dragging wagons with loot and gear,
laughing at how the righteous condemn them until the righteous need their steel.
The English prince, Edward of Woodstock, takes up the cause of Pedro of Castile against his half-brother Enrique. The French captains, led by Bertrand du Guesclin, offer the other side their swords. The stage is set for men to fight each other under different flags without changing their daily habits much at all. At Nájera, English-led forces win with flair, but victory delivers a bill that Gascon taxpayers will be asked to pay. The return from Spain carries wounded pride, rattling spoils, and a new clarity: campaigns have to be financed. And financing will now be a question as much for lawyers as for armourers. You sit with the Black Prince's council when they draft a hearth tax to fund arrears and obligations. The idea is clean: count hearths, set a rate, collect. The practice turns quickly thorny as towns cite ancient privileges, lords shield tenants they favour, and those with long memories ask whether customs did not say otherwise. Courtrooms become new battlefields where barristers speak as captains do in the field, probing, pressing, encircling. The prince's reputation for chivalry is tested by hard arithmetic. News of these taxes filters into villages mixed with grumbling about levies and with the hope that roads will remain safe if garrisons are content. Taxes are easier to bear when they buy calm. They are harder when neutrality costs extra and promises are late. On the sea, England learns again that fleets are not built of courage, but of coins and contracts. The alliance with Castile shifts as the political wind turns. Castilian fleets work with France. English convoys feel pressure, and a great defeat at sea reminds everyone that sailors' courage means little if hulls are outnumbered and oars no longer dominate waters where sails and galleys mix. Merchants add a new line to their margins to account for risk. Investors diversify, preferring shorter trips or safer routes. And the wool staple is asked to be a hinge for more weight than was planned. The slow economy of trust, the willingness of men to send goods to sea because they believe they will land and be paid for, becomes a little wobblier. On land, Du Guesclin shows how to wear out an enemy with refusals and sieges rather than with charges. He prefers to avoid decisive battle, a choice that disappoints poets and encourages builders of walls, diggers of trenches, and paymasters who know that time is on the side of the better budgeted. Towns that had pinned their loyalties to English custom privileges remeasure their comfort. If the French crown under Charles V offers regular justice, predictable taxes, and tolerable garrisons, the balance sheets in council chambers tip. By the decade's end, you can watch the map changing, not with a snap, but with a slow, even pressure. English-held territories shrink like a puddle drying after a hot wind rises. Men who once wore one badge over their tunics fold it away and pin another on, telling themselves that oaths are not broken when held to better reasoned authorities. Habit here is a tool of policy. You keep people doing the same thing while changing who collects the benefits. Captivity, meanwhile, becomes a civic habit. King John's ransom payments turn towns into co-signers for royal dignity. Merchants who have prospered on wine or cloth pledge money in return for privileges that they hope will outlast the political strain. Hostages live decorously in English households. Some learn the language well enough to conduct small business. A few marry and find that duties to home and duty to honor now have addresses on two shores. Children born into this ambiguity grow up with grandfathers who curse foreign names and fathers who calculate with them. You wonder how the children answer when asked where home is. Then you recognize that their answer will match their first steady job. There is a quiver in the economy that ordinary people do not name but feel. Ransoms drain coin that could have paid for repairs. Campaigns absorb men whose hands would otherwise turn mills and build barns. Convoys are diverted to carry powder and shot instead of salt and fish. Priests keep records with fewer names. Manorial rolls are thin. Lawsuits linger because judges ride more slowly. The price of tar goes up because more ladders are being made. The price of lead shifts because roofs and arrows quarrel for the same resource. None of this is catastrophic. It is wearying. The decade ends with a war resumed under new assumptions. That English advantage is no longer assured, that the sea is less friendly, that France is learning prudence, that princes may behave with stubbornness instead of brilliance and still win. At the lip of the next section, you are left with a question that has nothing to do with banners. When a war moves from the loud theatre of fields to the quiet theatre of budgets, and when the men who used to be famous for strokes of arms now become expensive to maintain as garrison commanders and court petitioners, who prospers, those who hold swords or those who hold pens? You watch the next 20 years as a lesson in what happens when a crown falls in love with competent men. Charles V of France is not a figure for epics. He is a figure for audit logs. Under him, reform moves through the realm like a careful mason, repairing stones without fuss. He stabilizes coinage. He strengthens the Chambre des Comptes. He invests in artillery and engineers. He cultivates captains who obey orders. He surrounds himself with lawyers who admire elegant statutes more than elegant tournaments. He builds a kingdom that feels less like an estate and more like an office. This is not poetry. It is power because people come to trust schedules more than speeches. On the English side, old age and succession unsettle. Edward III's vigour declines. The Black Prince's health fails. A youth Richard will inherit jobs that mature men struggle to do well. In between, courtiers make promises they cannot keep, and the kingdom feels the strain of trying to hold ground across the sea while repairing the roof at home. Taxation grows cleverer, and clever taxes often irritate most. A poll tax, that flat charge on every person, seems tidy to the treasurers who design it.
On the ground it stings.
When collectors come not with scales but with head counts, the poor learn to speak with one voice. Why should a day labourer's household pay like a prosperous farmer's? The question will not vanish. It grows in alehouses and fairs, in long queues at tax tables, in whispers passed among men who have learned letters in guild schools. Meanwhile, in France, Du Guesclin wears out enemies. He recovers towns with patience, siegecraft, negotiation, and the force of predictable pay. He declines battle when it offers drama but threatens disorder. Town after town calculates and decides that the less exciting sovereign is the better one. In their council halls, magistrates compare tariffs, court procedures, and the likely behavior of nearby captains. The most boring offers win. The English, for their part, must choose whether to fight for strong points that cost more to hold than they are worth to keep. Every garrison commander learns to write a certain kind of letter, respectful, detailed, pleading for funds, promising thrift, describing the wall's state in notes about mortar and stone and timber. The ones who write best often eat best. Trust in the sea declines for English merchants after defeats and after alliances shift. Insurance schemes, informal but real, expand. A set of burghers in a town agrees to share losses if one ship in a convoy is taken. Letters of marque multiply. Piracy blurs with war, and court cases in Admiralty multiply like fish in a lively river. Towns build bigger cranes on their quays. Customs officers refine their forms. Petty corruption grows in the spaces between too few men and too many details.
Again, none of this is dramatic.
All of it changes lives. A young man decides to apprentice in cloth finishing rather than in ship rigging. A father advises his son to try for the clerkship rather than for the sea. A widow who used to lend small sums to sailors now lends to tanners because hides are safe even when winds are not. The great schism acts like a quiet storm. Two papal courts call themselves the centre of Christendom. Kings choose sides. Clerics choose words. In parishes, the mass sounds the same. In councils, the allegiance is a calculated thing, not to souls but to revenues, appointments, and the price of exemptions. The faithful who live by candles and confession see little difference. The elites who live by dispensations and benefices see much. The schism sits over the war like a cloud that makes everything a little dimmer and more tentative. Men who used to make vows with clean consciences now make them with appended notes and contingencies. In England, the poll tax returns, and with it a refusal. In 1381, the refusal becomes a rising. You watch it through village greens and market squares. Men who have spent their lives weighed against sheaves and plough days cross invisible lines and speak as if they were allowed to ask why. They tear open manorial rolls. They march on towns. They confront officials who thought their seals sanctified and discover that seals are small comfort when a road fills with men who carry billhooks and move with intention. The rising carries a riot's messiness and a parliament's aspirations. It terrifies and then is put down, as such moments are. But something lingers. The memory that a man who pays may also speak does not leave the air easily. France absorbs fewer shocks in this decade because the king prefers sturdy men over brilliant ones. Du Guesclin dies as all men do. Institutions do not. The reforms continue. Artillery evolves from rumour to regularity. Small guns appear in more sieges. Powder stores are counted with the solemnity once reserved for relics. Founders who used to cast bells cast guns and bless both works. Watch captains learn to fear a new sound beyond the moan of trebuchets and the snap of mangonels. Walls get thicker at the base. Towers get lower and broader. Ditches are kept clean. A new vocabulary enters ordnances, calibers, carts, shot. The work is slow, expensive, and, because it looks like engineering rather than heroism, quietly irresistible. By the end of the 1380s, a truce appears on paper, easier to write than to keep. It rests on men being tired enough to stop, on treasuries being thin enough to plead for rest, on councillors being wise enough to ask for repairs before new adventures. You have learned to distrust truces as endings. They are transitions where habits shift a little, where free companies turn to guarding bridges as employees rather than as extortionists, where customs officers learn new rates and post new tables, where garrison captains become governors with more domestic duties than military ones. The oddity of a quiet year is that it produces as much work as a loud one, and still, the question that rises from the ledger's bottom line remains. If a realm rebuilds itself with clerks and carpenters, if it leans on men with scales and measures and a taste for exactness, does it become less vulnerable to men who like lances? Or does it simply shift vulnerability to the places where a clerk's mistake can halt a convoy and turn a town hungry? The next years will answer, and they will answer with a different sort of violence: civil war. You step into a France where a truce's gentle edges cannot contain sharp resentments. The king is ill, his mind wanders. Regencies and councils become courts in which cousins sharpen knives of policy, and then, occasionally, actual knives. Louis of Orleans and John the Fearless of Burgundy stand on either side of a divide that runs down streets and through kitchens. An alley becomes Armagnac and a bridge becomes Burgundian. Priests learn to preach peace with language that reflects tomorrow's likely ruler, guilds declare.
Men remove badges from sleeves not because they change their views, but because they wish to keep both hands. This civil war is not cavalry thundering across plains.
It is regulations on grain, interventions in city councils, assassinations disguised as necessity, police actions conducted by men in armor who insist they are keeping the peace. The Cabotian revolt in Paris carries the flavor of doctrinaire reform. Ordinances are posted that sound like a moral catechism for administration. End corruption. Regulate prices. Make justice swift. Limit the powers of great offices. Empower the voice of the city. Reform by force meets force by habit. The result is lists of exiles, changes in wardenship, and ordinary people who open their shutters cautiously, because today's proclamation might be void tomorrow.
And no one wants to be seen to have cheered the wrong banner.
In England, the crown itself changes hands in a way that feels theatrically quiet. A king is deposed and another crowned, and life in towns continues under the same market hours. But international posture shifts. Henry VIII is more cautious than hungry. He fights at the edges, Wales, the north, more than he dreams of pushing deeply into France. Traders who care mainly for convoys and tariffs prefer this. Clerks who like predictable exchequers prefer it too. The realm tends to its fences. Men who would like to be famous for acres and captives accommodate themselves to being famous for being paid. On the sea, piracy becomes a business with forms. Captains carry letters that authorize them to prey on enemies' goods. Admiralty courts schedule sessions. Lawyers find niches. Evidence piles up. Manifests, sworn statements, valuations, oaths. A town that once delighted only in fairs now delights in adjournments and decisions.
This is not romance.
It is how you turn violence into a regulated tax on an enemy's commerce. It is how you keep your own men from turning that tax on you. As 1415 approaches, a new king in England, Henry V, looks across the Channel and sees arithmetic and ambition. He is a man who prepares as if success were a product of lists. Ports are warned, bows are counted, carts are assembled, arrows are ordered by the 100,000. Stocks of timber are reserved for siege works. Ships are hired, surgeons are appointed, chaplains are chosen, and familiar men are promoted, the ones who have kept order in camps and accounted well for last year's chevauchée. Towns in the south coast feel the weight of purveyance anew. Inland shires provide horses. In France, divided yet still large, men argue in councils while the roads outside carry carts with flour and saltfish not to courts but to garrisons. Because the English will soon need opposition, and opposition eats too. You should notice one detail: the way households adjust to the rumours. A family close to a port counts its savings and considers whether to invest in a small boat to carry goods inland if coasts are troubled. A village near a road reinforces hedges and hides the best tools. Iron is dear and easier to lift than grain. A woman who runs a small cookshop along a causeway dries extra herbs and saves fat, knowing that soldiers eat thick soups and pay best on days near musters. A priest writes to a cousin in another parish, arranging to swap 2 barrels of wine for 2 sacks of flour before the roads fill with non-paying mouths. These little exchanges form a second economy under the official one, and they keep towns alive when plans made at palaces falter. When the English land and press, when Harfleur suffers and falls, when the march to Calais becomes a gamble played in mud, each town along the way must calculate again. Do you shut your gates and risk siege? Do you open your gates and negotiate terms? Do you pretend to neutrality and sell bread to both sides? You are not asked to decide what is noble. You are asked to decide what keeps your children fed. Agincourt, which poets will painfully ennoble, returns you to this same practical verge. The day after, villagers still need the mill wheel turning. Towns still need order posted at the hall. Garrisons still need supplies and pay. New crosses on graves must be cut from old boards. And a man with a knife in a back room will smooth the letters because the dead need names, even when the living wish to forget. As this section closes, you see the wheel turning toward a new sort of English effort. Not raids for ransom, but a state planted in conquered soil and expected to feed itself. Normandy will become the proof. The question now is less whether a field can be won than whether it can be taxed. You ask yourself, when an army wins not for a day but for a decade, and when its victory brings officials who love forms and weights, how does a town teach its children to live by those forms without forgetting their old one? You stand at a crossroads where victory looks like a warehouse. The English conquest of Normandy is a project carried out with ladders and ledgers. Each town taken is a granary acquired, a bridge gained, a tax roll inherited and revised. The soldiers who scale a wall are followed by clerks who scale a staircase to the room where the town's accounts are kept. They take possession of keys, then of books, then of lives, since a tax list is a story of households. Henry VI's strength is not only in his discipline at arms, but in his taste for rule as routine. He enjoys the clean orderliness of lists. He trusts men who stand quietly and add columns. Rouen is the hardest test. As the ring tightens, the city turns inward. Bakers' hours are regulated, meat prices fixed, hoarding punished, gardens raided for greens, candles rationed so that streets can still be watched. Watch captains walk their patrols on thin rations. The poor are expelled because a town is a stomach and must protect itself. In the winter's slim light, processions plead for relief. On the other side of the lines, the besiegers' camp has its own calendar. Payroll days, distribution of rations, the arrival of powdered barrels for guns, the inspection of fuses, the steady repair of battering engines, the careful recording of grain seized from countryside barns so that men of property will later be paid, perhaps, under the rules of purveyance. The siege ends with a set of terms that look humane on parchment and look inevitable to those on aching feet. When Rouen surrenders, any romance left in war breaks like stale bread. Administration then spreads like paint over dry walls. The English install an exchequer at Rouen, a system for weighing and counting that asserts a logic beyond personalities. Writs go out in French with English assumptions. Courts sit, contracts are honoured, privileges are confirmed when they polish compliance and curtailed when they hinder needs. A city that wanted independence now learns to want predictability. Bakers appreciate standards. Coopers appreciate advance orders. Boatmen enjoy set tolls. The presence of new garrisons shifts craft balances. More leather workers for harness, more smiths for bolts and locks, more carpenters for palisades and shutters. Mariners on the Seine adapt to patrols and signals. Villagers along the rivers learn to time their ferries to minimize dangerous encounters with men who mistake cargoes for spoils. You attend, in your mind, a session of the English Exchequer in Rouen in 1419 or 1420. Men present accounts in good order for famine relief and garrison pay. Receipts are checked, tallies matched. Discrepancies noted with a calm that signals authority. Money travels in chests under guard to pay men whose temper will improve for a week when coin clinks. Ordinances for cleanliness, for market hours, for watch rotas, for fire control are posted anew. English law is not purely imported. It is adapted to fit the old customs where possible, because customs are social gravity. To govern cheaply, you govern familiar habits and siphon value out of them. A tax that felt like oppression becomes tolerable when it buys a guard patrol that actually appears
on time and prevents a shop from being stripped by a band
who would call themselves neutrals otherwise. The Treaty of Troy brings a feeling like a careful performance on an ill-lit stage. The French king, broken by illness and by pressure, recognizes the English as heirs and governors. Nobles nod. Paris dresses windows.
A marriage unites houses.
Administrators on both sides sigh with the relief of men who prefer a document to a campaign. Clerks copy and recopy the terms. Seals hang heavy. Proclamations run through cities like a new breeze. For a moment it seems possible to live under two crowns without breaking in two. But a dual monarchy is a transport problem disguised as a constitutional arrangement. Orders must cross water and win time. Harvests must feed two budgets. Loyalties must stretch and not snap. And every local official must decide which superior's letter to obey first when the post brings conflicting dates. English rule in Paris with Burgundian support looks like city governance.
Anywhere that prefers order.
Taverns are policed, markets regulated, bridges maintained. Foreign soldiers learn to behave like locals once their pay is regular, and punishments are certain. Parish life continues, baptisms, funerals, guild feasts, and the everyday devotions that anchor memory. And yet every function wears a new badge. Sermons include little references to the rightness of the new order. Courts use a new formula to open sessions. Watchmen call the hour with different names. Steeple bells ring for processions that affirm dual sovereignty. Grand symbolism changes. Street-level practice remains. If you follow a convoy from Rouen to Paris in these years, you learn the texture of occupation. Guards carry pikes and quarrels. Carts carry flour and salted fish. A clerk carries a list that will be checked at gates. Cooks in the rear boil grain into pottage for drivers who eat with wooden spoons and dream of meat. Villagers along the route bring eggs and small cheeses to sell. A priest offers a blessing and gently asks whether an escort could accompany 3 women who must reach a sister's birthbed up the road. A captain declines, but assigns 2 men unofficially because goodwill carries coin into chests later. This is how authority sustains itself longer than excitement can hope to. Henry V's early death unsettles the machinery. Good machines can run for a while without a hand on the lever, but they break sooner when roads are bad and weather turns.
Regents and councils do their work.
Babies are anointed.
Oaths are renewed.
And everywhere a small doubt grows. Can a pattern this precise survive a slip? Normandy remains a lesson in how to rule a province with forms. Paris remains a lesson in how to rule a capital with allies. The countryside remains the same lesson it has always been. Walls are the only law that matters when men are hungry and pay is late. Stand back and look at the picture. The strongest things here are not men. They are habits. A government that knows how to post ordinances for fire, clean streets, paydays, coinage standards, and road repairs can survive owners changing above it. A town that knows how to keep watch lists, ration bread, and enforce the assize can survive flags changing overhead. A household that knows how to hide grain and keep silence can survive men changing crests. The treaty's promise is that habit will be enough to unite 2 realms. The doubt you feel sits in a detail. Roads clog. When roads clog, orders and coin arrive late. When coin arrives late, soldiers become less disciplined and bakers become less patient. With Lent approaching, barrels of fish must be moved. If a convoy is turned back one too many times, can careful rule keep its shape? You approach the walls of Orléans and everything you have learned about sieges gathers here. Rations and ropes, bastilles and boats, ladders and lists. The English position looks like a necklace of small fortresses, bastilles thrown up to choke the city and cut its river, because the Loire is life, carrying flour, wine, salt, and messages. The defender's job is to keep the river breathing. The besieger's job is to narrow it to a wheeze and then a stop. When each side calculates, it calculates in loads per day. How many barges can be slipped past at night? How many barrels can be rolled safely from quay to bakehouse? How many carts can be escorted from a nearby mill to a city gate? Orléans is not romance, though romance will be born here.
It is a schedule.
Bakers are told when to fire their ovens and how much to bake. Meat is rationed. Fish days bite harder. Gardens are turned to intensive cultivation. Candle use is restricted. Gates are opened and closed with sacred regularity. An entry in a city's account book reads with terrible normalcy: payment for rope, payment for pitch, payment for stone, payment for carts, payment for watch, payment for repair of a bridge pier. On the other side, a captain's muster roll lists wages due and arrows expended. A quartermaster notes flour issued. A clerk marks the day, a small gun burst and 2 men lost fingers. A surgeon records poultices and prayers. Even the battle that will be remembered for saints and standards, the convoy of barrels of fish guarded on a winter's day, turns on fast feet and barrels packed properly, on the discipline of men on a road whose ruts are known to locals by name.
Lent matters.
Diet shapes logistics. Because meat is not to be eaten, fish must be found. Because fish must be found, convoys become targets. Because convoys become targets, roads become arenas under rules that look austere on paper and look like death when arrows fall. You consider the balance. Religion dictates diet. Diet dictates supply. Supply dictates routes. Routes dictate battles. A medieval mind would call this a chain of providence. Your modern habit calls it an order of operations. Inside the city, guilds do the work that armies cannot do alone. Carpenters repair hoardings. Masons fill cracks and carve new embrasures. Coopers keep casks sound and dry. Boatmen with low silhouettes slip under night bridges with flour covered by straw. Women carry water and wood. Nurse the ill, keep order among children. Hurl stones when stones are the thing that saves time, and keep men from thinking only about hunger by telling them what must be done next, this hour, in this quarter. Watch captains enforce silence at night. Trumpet calls mark dawn and curfew. Priests carry relics to gates and bless, not as magical extravagance but as a way to make arms and legs do what fear tries to prevent. On the English side, a camp's life repeats its routines. Paydays are kept to sustain discipline. Woodcutting parties fill wagons because siege eats timber faster than it eats patience. Fletchers set aside time to repair and refletch shafts. Bowstrings are dried and warmed near embers. Gun crews measure powder cautiously and set fuses carefully. Mistakes are costly, but so is caution. A captain walks lines and nods at men who have learned to keep their gear dry. He thinks like a clerk and acts like a soldier. He needs both, because a siege that fails for lack of a rope is an offense to a mind that prefers to lose only to an enemy's talent. Not to its own laziness. There is a figure who enters now whom history will make more than she was, and yet who changed schedules by making men believe in their own plans again. You do not need to follow her visions to grasp her effect on quartermasters. Courage makes a city take risks, to sally, to force a crossing, to coordinate relief. Life inside walls is repetition. Life at gates is danger. Life on a river in spring is timing.
New confidence alters timing.
When you read the city's books, the numbers do not record visions, but they show boldness. More flour moved, more carts used, more ropes bought, more pay assigned to boatmen, more repairs demanded for a bridge in a week than in a month prior. A mind that tells itself that God favors the plan is a mind that makes the plan, not postpones it. The English chain of Bastille is strong when fed and fatal when thin. To hold a ring, each link must be able to live through a week of delays. A convoy missed here, a patrolling boat sunk there, a store of powder damp in a careless rain, and a place becomes weak. Coordinating many small posts turns commanders into dispatchers. If you have learned anything from this war, it is that dispatchers can lose battles when a bridge gives way at the wrong hour or a message is delayed by a cart's broken axle. The fight for Orléans is a fight among men who plan in hours and win in minutes. When the ring breaks and the city breathes, the earth does not shake. It exhales. Bakers adjust recipe ratios. City notaries shift from listing dead to recording repairs. Markets in nearby towns feel the change because more carts roll and prices rebound. Captains at outlying posts look at their larders and decide whether prudence requires withdrawal. Along the rivers, men with poles push laden boats with a confidence that feels like spring after winter. The great narratives will be written later. What matters to a parent that week is that a child eats bread not made of adulterated flour, that candles burn for reading and not only for watch, that gates open for market hours, that news carries more hope than hunger. But the war has not ended. Victory shows how a method can be defeated by a counter-method. Artillery augments courage. Bridges rebuild faster because carpenters have learned a new pattern. Generals who prefer caution can be pressured by cities that have tasted relief. Everywhere now, the ingredients of the end appear in small bowls on workbenches. Reliable guns, better carts, standardized shot, councils accustomed to funding standing companies, tax systems hardened by practice, and kings or regents who prefer competent stewards to gallant wastrels. The next decade will stir these ingredients into something like a modern state. Pause at Orléans' recovered gate and ask, if it took a holy banner to convince men to act according to practical schedules they already knew how to keep, how much of war's end belongs to vision, and how much belongs to men who learn to align carts, ropes, and courage at the same hour? You walk into years when the war ends, not because one side forgets how to fight, but because one side becomes better at doing what peace requires. Charles VII's France is a workshop. Officials build a permanent tax. They recruit companies on standing terms. They regularize pay. They invest in artillery not as wonder but as routine. The Compagnie d'Ordonnance make cavalry predictable. The Franks archers promise to populate ranks with trained bowmen. The artillery, notably managed by men who think in weights and fuses, gives sieges a new tempo. The names of the Bureau brothers belong to this world. Men who make guns and shot move like a supply chain rather than a miracle. When a captain asks for a train of guns, he knows what he will receive, in what quantity, dragged by how many horses, served by how many men, with how much powder. An instruction manual hiding in the margins of orders. Guns change walls and habits. Towns with old pride and thin purse have to decide whether to thicken earthworks or tighten belts. Carpenters learn to build gabions. Ditch diggers become valued. Ironmongers discover that hoop and shot both pay well. In English-ruled regions, garrison commanders read this change with anxiety and ask their superiors for funds to update defences.
Funds come slower than carts.
Normandy, for a while orderly under exchequer methods and watch lists, starts to feel a squeeze. Merchants weigh loyalty against the likelihood that the tax they pay today will be considered loyalty tomorrow or treason when flags change. Pragmatism overtakes oath, markets trade, cautious but alive. Battles return but look different. Formigny is not a poem. It is an exercise in outmaneuvering with combined arms, guns placed cleverly, arrows still murderous, men moving with more discipline than swagger. Castillon is the field's last lesson. The English, brave in a tradition that loves charges and banners, meet a fortified artillery park and die for an old rhythm. Talbot falls, a man out of time on a field arranged by the new. The French gunners do not seem like heroes when you picture them. They are craftsmen executing with sober competence.
They are paid.
Their powder is dry. Their shot fits. Their captain cares more about angles than about speeches. Victory flows toward men who watch fuses. Between these concluding battles, the reconquest proceeds in the clerk's tone. Towns change hands after assessors list assets. New courts sit. Taxes are set and collected. Exemptions are argued. Normandy's exchequer is repurposed. Rouen learns to obey again. Caen adapts from one list of officials to another that looks similar on paper and different in its loyalties. Bordeaux and Gascony become final acts. The English drink their last long draught of easy wine. Merchants calculate how to bring claret from friendlier ports, or how to turn to other goods, or how to love ale more than Bordeaux. The shift hurts but does not kill. It reforms habits in taverns and in counting houses. In England, the loss feels like a change of posture more than a wound. Parliamentarians speak satisfactions and regrets. They ask for accounts. They wonder whether too much was asked of the realm for too long. They begin to look inward because inward will soon demand more than outward. Calais remains like an old coin in a pocket, a habit you do not abandon because it still buys something. Garrisons there stay busy with drills and with tariff tables. English merchants continue to walk French streets, counting bales, arguing weights, translating measures with the ease born of a century of mixed commerce. Warfare's last gift to governance is permanence. A permanent tax, once grudging and emergency, becomes ordinary. Standing forces, once scandalous to a free imagination, become necessary to minds that know how quickly pirates become kings if seas and roads are left unguarded. Provincial governors who used to swagger now submit regular reports measured by the same terms for all. The centre takes power not in a blaze, but in a steady flame that warms and burns with equal reliability. France becomes a state in a way it had only pretended before. England becomes a state in a way it had already begun to be. Both realms more capable of maintaining roads, regulating coin, adjudicating disputes, enforcing standards, and fielding forces with less drama. The people who live under this new normal do not call it modern.
They call it less dangerous.
Bakers bake more reliably. Fares are safer. Convoys are regular. Letters arrive. Coin is less clipped. Salt is cheaper in some years because roads are sound enough to carry it quickly. Guilds still guard secrets. Priests still hear confessions. Merchants still prefer profit to risk. The difference is density of forms, of officials, of schedules, of predictable aches. You can almost hear the quiet pride in a council chamber when a treasurer presents figures that match last year's within a tolerable error. That pride is civilization turned from feast to staple. The war leaves scars that are easy to name and habits that are harder to see. The scars, villages never repopulated, fields turned to scrub. Names of saints worn smooth on stones where so many hands have asked for food or protection. Cemeteries larger than the memory of why. The habits, saving against uncertainty, hiding grain wisely, teaching children to keep counsel,
Measuring twice before trusting once.
preferring a dull officer to a brilliant one, liking roads that lack ambushes and markets that lack surprises. These habits will travel forward into other centuries. They will become a cultural weather, temperate, cautious, industrious. At the end, you return in imagination to a house at dusk. A woman cuts bread, cheaper, better bread than in her mother's day, because grain moved easily this year and mills ran. A man checks a door whose lock was set by a smith who learned his trade in a lord's workshop maintained after the war. A child traces letters learned at a parish school that exists because revenues are steady enough to fund it. Outside, a watch calls the hour, and a dog barks once and then sleeps. The bells toll a regular peal that used to signal alarms and now measures the goings of a market day. Somewhere, a clerk closes a book on an even column of sums and allows himself to believe that tomorrow will look like today. The 100 Years' War did not end with a sword held up to a setting sun. It ended with doors locked at reasonable hours, with weights that met standards, with taxes paid without riot, with troops who preferred their wages to their plunder, with kings who listened to men who knew roads. If you want a last question to carry into sleep, let it be this. when peace is nothing more than the success of dull virtues? Punctuality, attention, exactness. Are you willing to honor dullness as the reason your children can be bored?